Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Miller Espinosa, and I'm going to be the moderator for this session. This is the last session in the series of the future of workplace dispute resolution. And today we're going to be talking about the future of ombuds. I have with me today three esteemed panelists: Angela Dash, Chuck Howard, and Arthur Perlstein, and I'm going to be introducing them in more detail in a moment. But before we begin our talk, just a reminder, thank you to those of you who were on earlier sessions, and thanks to those of you who have joined us for this one. This Future of Workplace ADR series is dedicated to Professor David Lipsky, who is a retired professor at the Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations, and it is to recognize and thank Professor Lipsky for his leadership and many contributions to the field. In addition to thanking Professor Lipsky, the Future of Workplace ADR series also is honoring the memory of arbitrator Marcia Greenbaum from Massachusetts. Arbitrator Greenbaum was a past president, a Pioneer Award winner, past president of SPIDER, and was a mentor leader and dispute resolution program developer. For our meeting today, we would like the audience to pose questions and comments through the Zoom chat. If you could please stay muted throughout the program, we would appreciate that. There's just too many of us here to unmute ourselves. And this session is going to be recorded and will be available on the LERA website. We are going to end on time after 60 minutes. So at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll be concluding our session. As I said, I'm Sarah Miller Espinosa, the moderator for this session. And now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists. First, I'm going to be introducing Chuck Howard. Chuck is the Executive Director of the International Ombuds Association. And prior to becoming the Executive Director of IOA, Chuck was for many years a partner and general counsel of Shipman and Goodwin, which is a law firm, a very large law firm in Connecticut, where he represented ombuds offices at major corporations, universities, research facilities, and other organizations throughout the United States. Chuck is also the author of the Organizational Ombudsman, Origins, Roles, and Operations, a legal guide, which is a must-have for any ombuds office. Next, I'm going to be introducing Angela Dash. Angela is the founder and president of the PACE Institute. She has 20 years of public sector leadership and management experience. She is a national trainer, an executive and professional coach, an organizational ombuds. She was also previously a classical ombuds. She's adjunct faculty at NYU's School of Professional Studies, and she has her PhD in conflict analysis and resolution with an emphasis in conflict in organizations, schools, and healthcare. Welcome, Angela. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Arthur Perlstein, who is the Director of Arbitration and the Director of Shared Neutrals at the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. Arthur's previous roles at FMCS include General Counsel, Director of ADR and International Programs, and Commissioner of Mediation. Also, Arthur previously served as a professor of law and the director of the Werner Institute for Negotiation and Dispute Resolution at Creighton University School of Law. So I'll welcome all of our panelists. I just want to briefly tell you about our session today before I turn it over to all of them. So today we're going to be focusing on the future of organizational ombuds in workplace conflict resolution. As those of you who have joined us know, and probably many of you are, organizational ombuds. Organizational ombuds are designated neutrals who are appointed or employed by an organization to facilitate the informal resolution of concerns of employees, students, and sometimes external clients of the organization. Organizational ombuds are impartial, confidential, independent conflict resolvers that informally aid in the resolution and mitigation of conflict within organizations by assisting individuals in identifying and assessing options to resolve concerns, as well as identifying systemic issues within organizations. With that in mind, we have two questions that we're going to ask each of our panelists to answer today. And once they have answered these questions, we're going to invite your questions for the panelists and any comments you have on these questions. So these two questions are, what is your perspective on the current state of organizational ombuds programs, particularly those programs focused on the resolution of workplace conflict? And second, what are your predictions on where and how organizational ombuds programs will evolve in 10 years? So by 2031, where are we going to be in terms of ombuds programs? And we're going to begin with Chuck Howard, and I'm going to stop this share. Chuck?
All right, thank you very much. And this is a lot to cover in 10 minutes or so of my part of the panel, so we'll have room for questions. So let me get us started with my answer to the first question, and then I'll move on to the second question. The short answer to the first question is, I think organizational ombuds, which I'm going to call just ombuds, are still not seen as a must-have function by many major organizations. But I think that is changing. In part, I think it's changing because ombuds have gained recognition in some significant reports in the last few years, because they are an answer to the need for a confidential resource to help people, especially with issues like harassment and discrimination. And because ombuds are very effective in helping both people with conflict and surfacing issues, as well as organizations by identifying systemic issues and gaps. And finally, I think ombuds programs are currently rapidly expanding in new and different venues to meet otherwise unmet needs. So let me back up a little bit and give you some context for this answer. My analysis starts with the recognition that our workforce, workplaces, in fact, our whole society is rapidly changing. Given the time limits for this program, my points are going to be very truncated, but much of this is common knowledge and I think you'll appreciate them. But when you put them all together, I think it does create the context in which ombuds offices can be very useful. I start with demographics and particularly increased diversity. The current majority white population will be a minority by 2040 something. I think there's greater realization now about diversity, including recognition of the LGBTQ community. And this is about more than just diverse people. With them, they bring diverse backgrounds, perspectives, and cultures. And I think it's hard to find a workforce today that doesn't reflect people of the world. But the clash of people and cultures in the workplace is what makes dispute resolution all the more important in today's workplace. In addition to diversity, I think we have work-life changes. Employees switch jobs more frequently. Part of that is the younger generation, as those of us, as you can tell from the color of my hair, in the baby boom generation move along and get out of the way. But also it's the increasing use of the gig economy, which is now about 40% of all workers. So those people are not even employees, they're contract workers, contingent workers, or just part-time. Even after the pandemic, I think there will still be remote workers. And with that comes a sense of less connection to the workplace, to the employer, if there is one, less confidence and loyalty to an employer, and people are less likely to try to work within a system. I think a reflection of their vulnerability is that often they will just leave when there's an issue or a problem. Added to that stew is the technology changes, and this is something of a paradox. We have more connection on a 24/7 basis with technology, but less personal connection. And I think that exacerbates the sense of less connection from all of the factors that I've just described. And compounding all of that is the social and political upheaval that our country and our society is experiencing, as we have deep racial, cultural, political divides in our society. And there's no reason to think that what we see going on in the society at large is less significant in our organizations. Again, the result is more conflict. Against this background, I think the good news is that there is a general recognition by most, I think, major organizations that they need to appeal to, recruit, and promote women and people of color. I think this is a matter of necessity given the changing demographics in the workforce. I think it's also a necessity given the changes in the marketplace for goods and services. All you have to do is look at the advertisements on the internet or on television to see just incredibly different diversity. I think it's also a function of Black Lives Matter and some of the police conduct cases that have been in the news for the last few years. And with all of that, the studies show that greater diversity results in better decision-making by organizations, a more engaged workforce, and a more productive workforce. But here's the rub, I think. With that diversity recruitment and promotion that is generally, I think, widely seen as necessary, what is not widely seen is the need to support those people. And so I think the diversity recruitment and promotion efforts are on a collision course with certain conditions in our workplace. I think there are still major workplace problems faced by employees of all types, but particularly these two groups, people of color and women. One of them is harassment and discrimination. The IOA, the group that I work for, prepared a press release last June that talked about 5 recent studies from 2018 to 2020, all of which recognized the need for a confidential resource, and all of which recommended the use of Ombuds programs to help people in the organizations. These studies were from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, Harvard Business Journal, and the Urban Institute. And it really is pretty profound when you see some of the data. I'm just going to refer a little bit to some of the statistics from the Urban Institute report, which found that the fact that so few people come forward to report harassment suggests that they feel unsafe or uncomfortable in doing so. It also cited a study that found that, quote, the majority of respondents who had previously reported harassment said that they would never come forward again. And that, quote, research shows workers who come forward with concerns actually fare worse. They leave the organization sooner, face barriers to advancement, and often feel like they have ended their careers. And even more significantly, the Urban Institute found that the studies show that the majority of people who file harassment complaints are met with retaliation. So finding effective ways to help people to provide support for those types of issues is very important. In addition, we have a general lack of support for employees now. And there was a recent major study by McKinsey of great scope on the role of race in the workplace, focusing on Black experience. And it found lack of mentors, lack of support for these newly recruited or promoted workers was a major impediment. And so what is missing, I think, even though there's recognition of the need for greater diversity and promotion, what's missing is the recognition of the need for a confidential resource to support and sustain those diversity efforts. And I think there's also a lack of recognition that the existing structures that most organizations have are not enough. And why? Because most of those are formal channels, HR, compliance, hotlines, whistleblower policies, and that sort of thing. They result in investigations and they can't be confidential. What people, I think, want and what they need is a confidential resource where they can go and talk through their problems and someone who can actually help them. And especially so when they're uncertain, they're not sure they're right, they're not sure what they observe, they're not sure how to deal with it. Maybe they're dealing with people that have come from cultures that are new to them. So It's those types of things where people feel vulnerable. Maybe you're a gig worker and you need your job and you're not willing to raise an issue. So how can you do that? And part of the problem is, who do they turn to for that? Well, you can't go to the formal channels because they're not confidential. Union membership is now slightly over about 6%. If the results of the recent Amazon experience in the South was any indication, unions are not likely going to be surfacing again on any scale anytime soon. But ombuds can help. An organizational ombuds can be a confidential source of information, of coaching and guidance, can help in developing options to resolve conflict and surface issues. And it fits perfectly in complementing diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So without this extra support to help people and also support those efforts, I think those initiatives will fail. And this realization is slowly emerging. With that, I think there's also a growing recognition that the power of an ombuds can be applied in different contexts. So what we have seen over the last few years is growing use of ombuds in the K through 12 school district level. It's already been a major role in universities for many, many years, but now it's going to a place where there's a great deal of conflict and uncertainty, and the need for people who can provide information and guidance for people. In addition to that, I think smaller organizations are beginning to recognize the need for ombuds. In the past, these smaller organizations have really not been able to do so because the sense is that you need to have a organization that can support a full-time ombuds. But now we have external ombuds who practice to standards, and so that there's a greater opportunity. In fact, it helps preserve confidentiality to have an external ombuds. And finally, another context that's a new one is back in the days, you can remember probably, when we actually used to have conferences. Well, I think we will have conferences again at some point. But over the last few years, there has been a need for ombuds at conferences because you take the mixture of workplace activity and social activity, often with dinner and alcohol over extended days away from home, and there's been conduct that needs to be addressed. And again, people are worried about how to do that in effective ways. So all of this is, I think, causing a surge in organizations and people interested in ombuds programs. And for my little corner of the world, I think we saw an increase of 200 members in the IOA last year. And I'm routinely fielding inquiries from organizations, large and small, of all different types, about how they can create ombuds programs. Where will this go by 2031? That is a long way away. But some of the things that I've described are not going to go away. Those trends will continue. There will be increased diversity. We're going to be a need for additional support. And I think there will be additional applications, venues where ombuds haven't been used in the past, where they can be used in the past. And I think with that comes a recognition that ombuds can help everyone in an organization. The fact that they are particularly useful for women or people of color doesn't in any way impede them from helping those people who feel threatened by the increased diversity or by women or people of color. They can help everybody. One of the great surprises for some people is the role that they play in helping senior management and particularly middle management make better decisions and help those organizations. So they're directly responsive to people who are afraid, uncertain, unsure where to go, or fear retaliation. And I think with that will come a recognition that while they help people, they also can be very valuable in helping the organization itself by identifying emerging or systemic issues, and as basically a contributor to the thought leadership of senior management, because they have a unique perspective. They know about what's going on. While they're not going to disclose those confidential communications, they can draw from that insight information that can help fill gaps, create better policies, and they can communicate that to senior leaders. So with all of that, I think over the next 10 years, you'll also find stronger professional associations. I'm the first executive director that IOA has ever had, and I think it will continue to have that function long after I'm not in that role. But I think with that will come more training, more professional training, and more member services that will help organizations who want to have that and help ombuds in that role. And my final prediction for the future is I think this will be a worldwide function. All you have to do is go back and watch the growth of the HR function and the compliance function. Those are relatively new functions. Ombuds is further along or further back in the process of development. But I think it will be seen as filling a niche that none of these other functions fill, and hopefully become something that's quite commonplace by 2031. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. Now we're going to move to Angela. Angela, as a reminder for the audience, our questions are, what is your perspective on the current state of organizational ombuds programs, particularly those programs focused on the resolution of workplace conflict? And what are your predictions on where and how organizational ombuds programs will evolve by 2031? Angela?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Actually, a lot of the things that Chuck Howard mentioned really paints a picture of just where we are as a society, right? The gig economy, even small organizations wanting to use and have ombud services. The advancement and attention on diversity, equity, inclusion. All of those things are impacting the current state of the ombuds field. So I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into the lens that I come from. And one, so I'm someone who purposely said, I want to be an organizational ombuds. Like I said that years before being able to finally get into an organizational ombuds position. And I also come from a lens of coaching as well. And when I was trying to get in the field, right, I was building my tools in facilitation and training. Of course, I was already a mediator, but even advancing my tools in mediation. And I came to the role thinking, oh, I'm going to be doing a lot of mediation. And I realized, that's not what I'm doing at all. You know, I could probably count how many times I actually had to do a mediation in my role. And most of it was using my other tools like the coaching tools or facilitation tools or training tools, even some organizational development insight. And because there are a lot of programs now that are training people in conflict management, I think the ombuds field is being more on the radar of individuals in that space. I think you're going to have more and more people coming into the ombuds role, seeing opportunities to use all of those tools. And that, I believe, is going to, and I'm seeing that already. And so historically, you know, when I talk to people, a lot of people kind of stumbled into the ombuds role, right? Now you're having people kind of waiting at the door, waiting to get in, like this is their intention to become an ombuds. And I think that is changing the narrative about how we see our role or the expansion even of our role. And still within, hey, we're neutral. This is alternative dispute resolution. But what are the various tools that we're bringing with this role and how we're serving? With the gig economy, people are becoming more and more comfortable with the normalization of remote work. And actually a couple of years ago at the IOA, International Ombudsman Association Conference, I served on a panel then. I think that was, I'm losing track of my years. I think that was a couple of years ago. It was the last in-person conference we had. And it was it was addressing like things that we can kind of look at as far as to learn from other spaces about where we can go. And part of that was, how do we use technology to support the work we do? How are we adapting, even in being able to serve remotely? And this was before COVID. And so there was a lot of discussion, I remember at that conference, about Well, what about confidentiality? You know, if you're doing Ombuds work over the phone or video, you know, what about confidentiality? Like, people can record you. And I'm thinking, people could record you in your office. And actually that happened shortly after the conference, where something happened like that at Savannah College of Art and Design with the Ombuds, where a student actually recorded an in-person meeting with the Ombuds. And I'm sharing this to say that we're at a time of shifting how we think about the work that we do and how we do it, and even thinking like through an entrepreneurial mindset of how we do the work that we do. And so now COVID hit. So now we've been forced to operate remotely, right? We've been forced to have Zoom meetings or telephone meetings. And I can imagine some ombuds have realized, oh, this works. This works. And of course, we know a lot of companies have said, oh, this works. And not only just with the ombud services, but just operations. Now, what Chuck Howard said is, hey, but this creates some other dynamics, this working virtually. So how do we build trust in a virtual environment? You know, how do we build teams in a virtual environment? How do we manage conflict in a virtual environment? And so with my coaching hat on, right? So I do a lot of coaching sessions with individuals who, of course, because of COVID, now are managing in this virtual environment, whether they're an individual contributor, whether they are a leader. I've had coaching sessions with people who they started their jobs in this virtual environment, even as a leader. And so their challenges are really different. And it can create different types of conflict, right? And so for us to also become educated on how do we support people who are dealing with conflict in this virtual environment. So we're now going to be challenged to become more educated, even from an organizational development perspective, of how do organizations manage successfully in this type of space, because some organizations aren't going to go back. They're not going to go back, you know, I know companies, I've had clients who say, hey, they've said that we're not going back in the office, even after COVID. However, they are still desiring thought partnership and how to work through tough situations. And so how do we as an ombuds educate ourselves, equip ourselves with the tools to be able to do that? So it's not just about, hey, managing conflict, but it's understanding what are the different sources of conflict in an environment like this? And because even before that, we're moving into a gig economy, I think that the direction that we're going in is that companies are going to be more open to hiring or outsourcing their ombuds work. They're going to be more open to it. You have people in younger generations where that's normal. That is normal. So it's normal, as Chuck said, people come in and they leave, come in and they leave. So it's not like they're expecting an embedded ombuds in that way. I think that type of thinking is going to change, and actually is changing. When I first became an organizational ombuds, I put a lot of effort, which I think is important, in building trust within the community. It was a campus, and so I served faculty, staff, and students within that community, building trust, doing outreach, which is very helpful, right? Doing outreach so people can know who I am. And what I've learned too, outside of my ombuds work, that there are employees who are okay with connecting with a complete stranger, never have seen them before, and sharing confidential information with them. And as they're trying to work through some tough situations at work. And so I've seen that, not from my ombuds hat, but from my coaching hat, where there are many employees and companies who are who feel safe with saying, hey, please provide some confidential support to our employees, you this outside vendor, and the employee not even knowing who's going to be on the other end of that line, and is completely comfortable with that. And it helps them to feel even more safe with the independence and the confidentiality. So where I see us headed is for us to, and so this is 10 years from now, right? 2031. We're talking about 10 years from now. I see more external ombuds. I see more remote, so external and remote ombuds. I see there being a comfort level with that. I see it happening even now. I also see there being a need for ombuds who can support like the whole person and the whole organization. And when I say that in the coaching world, we say coach the person and not the problem, right? And so when you coach the person and not the problem, there's an opportunity to transform. And that actually, even as an ombud, is my approach. So even when I'm, it's conflict coaching 101 with an individual, my goal is for that person to walk out or leave that engagement with me also transformed in how they think about their situation, transformed with some new confidence in managing that current situation and future situations, transformed in now having maybe some new competencies, some skills to deal with that dispute or conflict or future conflicts. And so if we're coaching, or I want to say coaching, serving the person and even the whole organization and not just focus on what is the problem, I think we're adding more value in transforming organizations and helping to transform the people in the organizations. And people are looking for that. I think people are also looking to us regarding diversity, equity, inclusion, right? And so we're neutral. And I've seen in this space, since Black Lives Matter, and just, of course, it's been ongoing, right? Racial unrest and different social justice issues. And I know as an ombuds, we're thinking, okay, how neutral am I supposed to be, right? But are we neutral about social justice? Like, is that something we need to be neutral about? So I think that that's something that we will be challenged about, because for me, I don't want to be neutral on something like that. Is not an area of neutrality, right? And so I think we're going to be challenged in that way, and challenged to be culturally competent, and challenged to be able to facilitate dialogue and have some real discussions with people around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And so I think that that's something that's currently happening right now that's being activated in people, even in how ombuds are thinking about their roles or being conflicted. And I also think that that is going to be an expectation. So, and that goes back to coaching, or not coaching, excuse me, y'all. I'm a coach. I teach coaching too. So excuse me with my language. I keep saying coaching. That's going to go back to us supporting the whole organization, but not just the problem. And so being adaptable in that. And there are a lot of ombuds who are also gravitating to coaching. And I think that's the case because they have seen how those skills are so valuable, even in their ombuds work, how it's so relevant and valuable, and that strengthen their interest. And so I think we're going to have a lot of ombuds who are also coming with various types of skills, which will just increase the value that's added in the organizations. And so y'all may hear some banging. I have some renovation being done in my basement. So hopefully you don't hear it, because I can hear it. But yeah, one more thing, I just think it's going to be important that we think about how we tell our story, because when people hear ombuds, people are like, well, what is that? You know, so how do we tell our story, which I know is an ongoing conversation, but how do we tell our story so people can just really resonate with how we can add value and how we do add value at the most expanded way possible? And that's it.
Thank you, Angela. Arthur, I'm going to remind the audience again the questions that you'll be answering. What is your perspective on the current state of organizational ombuds programs, particularly those programs focused on the resolution of workplace conflict? And what are your predictions on where and how organizational ombuds programs will evolve by 2031? Thank you, Arthur.
Thanks very much. And two hard acts to follow. I basically agree with just about everything that Chuck and Angela had to say. For those of you who are here for the last session on systems and conflict management, I think that the ombuds role is very much a critical part of any conflict management system in an organization. In fact, I would go so far as to say that if there was, I've got to start my timer here so I don't go. If there was one thing, if there was only one thing you could have in an organization aimed at conflict resolution, I would want it to be the ombuds. I'm going to sort of answer those questions and look at sort of three different things, three different aspects. One is, what are the barriers? What are the barriers now to there being ombuds programs, and what will be the barriers in the future? What about ombuds programs in the unionized organization? And then I'm going to talk briefly about the ombuds role in the federal government, organizational ombuds role in the federal government. My passion in conflict resolution and conflict management, which I've been in for over 20 years, really is in the design of conflict management systems. I've worked with creating ombuds programs and promoting them and recommending them. So I think it's very, very important. So looking first at barriers. One of it in the work that I've done, and this biggest set of barriers that I've seen come under sort of the heading of turf battles, because usually an ombuds program is not the first thing that happens. In many cases, I mean, you know, organizations, big ones anyway, have a general counsel's office, they have an HR office, they'll have an EEO office or EEO function, et cetera. And very often the folks in these functions feel like, well, you know, we already do that and we don't need another, you know, and that's where there's lots of pushback in that. Some of these are overlapping. Another turf barrier is budget. Organizations, particularly when they're tightening belts, it's sort of like, you know, you got to justify that. You know, we just don't have the money in the budget. I've heard many times, not only about ombuds, but mediation programs and so forth, this will only create more conflict because then people are going to come to us with, you know, with every conflict rather than just, I guess, keeping quiet about it. And even where ombuds programs exist, very often the folks who could use it are unaware that it exists, or of its value. And I've run across that on so many occasions. Too few people understand and appreciate what an ombuds program can do. One of the problems with these barriers is, you know, the best way to sell new expenditures to large organizations, you know, relates to cost benefit. Hey, what am I going to get out of this? And can you quantify it and so forth? And there has been a remarkable scarcity of research on this in the world of ombuds. In fact, you know, if you research this question, you'll find tons of articles that are about the need for research in this area. There's no scarcity of that kind of thing, but there's a scarcity of the kind of hard research that you can present in a corporate office or whatever it might be to say, hey, here's, you know, here's how this is going to really affect the bottom line. We can prove it. I mean, areas, you know, selling points in that regard are things, everything from, you know, reducing or increasing productivity, not losing it due to pervasive conflict, attrition that you might have when people just get frustrated and leave, publicity, you know, minimizing negative publicity by having a channel for that. Minimizing significant violations of policies and in internal, you know, ethical codes and so forth. Reducing grievances of different kinds, reducing litigation and litigation costs, and also minimizing high-risk safety issues. And the reputation of an organization, both in terms of from the outside and also to be able to recruit new people to the organization. It can be a selling point. So I think it's very important to be focusing more and more on making the case. I think one of the things that can often be convincing is when you can provide examples from very large respected organizations, particularly, you know, big corporations that have a lot at stake, that have developed ombuds programs that they're proud of, and that, you know, I think holding those kinds of things out, and not only in corporations, but in other kinds of entities is probably the best selling angle in my opinion. Then in the unionized context, this is something that I've looked at a great deal. I was involved in a project that I spearheaded at FMCS some years ago, that we ended up calling DIADS, Dynamic Adaptive Dispute Systems. This was something I convened a task force, and one of the first people that I got for it was David Lipsky, who made tremendous contributions to that. And one of the things, you know, there's this assumption that a lot of people had, and many still have, that unions don't like the idea of having ombuds. So we sort of put that to the test a little bit. Dave arranged some meetings with some major union officials. And we basically said to them, well, what if the unions were involved in developing the ombuds program and in selecting an ombuds and so forth? And they kind of liked the idea. Very often, as it turns out, in work that we did, unions are very happy to have somebody else deal with certain kinds of conflict. Conflict between union members, for example, conflicts that really have nothing to do with the collective bargaining agreement, for another example. We identified in the project that we did, you know, we ended up publishing an article in the Harvard Negotiation Law Review, a number of best practices, but the creation of an ombuds or ombuds-like function was high among the best practices. And I've become more and more convinced about this over the years. Then looking at the federal context, in the federal government, they're the same turf issues, only I think more so. People in federal bureaucracies get very, very dug in. So you've got, you know, counsel's office and HR and EEO and so forth. But many federal agencies, if not most, have some kind of office called ADR or something like that. It's sort of like, wait a minute, we already do. So you've got a lot of players and there's a lot of that. But there are quite a few federal agencies that have organizational ombuds. There is a coalition of federal ombuds, aka COFO, which does a lot of promotion of it. And within the last few years, ACUS, the Administrative Conference of the United States, you know, had another look at this. They identified about 150 agencies with ombuds programs, but that includes outward-facing ombuds programs, not just organizational. But they made strong recommendations that Congress and agencies look at creating ombuds offices. They emphasized, the importance of the adherence to the principles of independence, confidentiality, impartiality, and they identified some best practices and so forth. It's very clear within the federal government that there's tremendous variability. I consider one of the giants in the world of federal ombuds programs, Howard Gadlin, in a piece that he wrote, referred to, and I'm quoting, tremendous inconsistencies in how agencies define and structure the role of ombudsman, how ombuds officers interpret their role, and how the ombuds function is viewed and treated by agency leadership. And that is very variable. I remember when we were doing a pilot project in creating a conflict management system at one agency. After a few minutes, we were trying to get sort of an initial overview as to whether this made sense for a pilot project. We asked a lot of questions. We talked about the kinds of conflict. We looked into that. We looked at the avenues they had. And then we started talking about some of the things that we might assist them with. And we mentioned the creation of an ombuds office. And they said, oh, we already have an ombudsman. Oh, and it hadn't been mentioned in all that time by these people who, were leaders and sort of. I said, well, how much is it used? Not all that much. Well, how did you create this program? Who is your ombuds? Oh, it's Fred. Well, how did you choose him? Fred has been with the agency for decades and decades, and really, he's we were trying to figure out something for him to do. So he knows people. So we figured, okay, well, this is a role for him. It was no surprise that it was not an effective ombuds function. So that, that kind of thing does happen. In the federal sector, there's a big issue regarding confidentiality. The Administrative Dispute Resolution Act does provide for confidentiality. Ombuds is specifically named in the act. It does provide for confidentiality, but there are some ambiguities. There are a number of federal statutes and regulations regarding, duties to report certain kinds of information, federal record keeping, Freedom of Information Act, Privacy Act, and so that is an important issue. Last but not least, I want to mention FMCS, and we are accelerating now our efforts to try to promote the creation and use of ombuds office in the federal government. And one of the things that we're very fortunate, I've worked twice on creating an ombuds office at FMCS. The first time we had a task force, we did everything, we made recommendations, and then it died with the director's departure. This time around, we were very, very fortunate because we had a woman named Karen Dean on a detail. She was the ombuds of the Patent Trademark Office, and Karen is terrific. She's a wonderkind, and she and I worked together on, overcoming the hurdles at FMCS. And Karen is now the ombuds, which is just a fantastic thing. But a couple of things we want to do. One is, we need an internal ombuds, and that, it's still early in that. But the second part of that is going to be that through that ombuds office, when it expands, we want to be able to offer ombuds services to smaller agencies who can't afford their own individual organizational ombuds. And also to be able, and this is something that I've already played a role in, to help agencies create ombuds offices as part of the design of a dispute system, a conflict management system. So I'll stop there so there's some time for questions, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Arthur. And audience, please do send your questions and comments through chat. I see that we did have some questions about how or where ombuds report in organizations, and there's some variation. And I'm wondering, maybe Chuck, if you can talk about that a little from the IOA perspective.
Sure. Are you talking about where the ombuds report in the organization? Or
yes.
Okay. Well, the highest level possible, and IOA is a little bit flexible on that. If it's an appropriate thing to do, the CEO, or the next level down, the provost, the COO. But what makes it important that it go to a very senior level is that the ombuds should be understanding that the role of the ombuds is both to help people and to help the organization. So the ombuds needs to be in a position to distill from the cases that come to the ombuds insights that at a senior level could be useful. And so putting themselves in the position of a senior leader, what could you do with the information that I'm now supplying you with? So sometimes it's a policy that should be revised or enacted. Sometimes it is a procedure. Sometimes it is, catching things that fall through the gaps. One of the most important functions, I think, is the idea of check, as in checks and balances, having an independent line to senior leadership in an organization, where if things go awry or get stuck or the information flow is blocked, you have access to the very top. What you shouldn't do is report to one of the other formal channels, a general counsel or a compliance office, an HR, an EEO. I've seen actually people who are half-time affirmative action officers and ombuds. That is never a good idea, because you're not seen as independent, neutral, and confidential. And those are the kind of core principles on which ombuds practices are based: to be independent and seen as independent, confidential, informal, and impartial. So you need to be a senior person, but you need also to have that senior person be a supporter. And the right ombuds will gain credibility with that senior leadership. And so I've actually been in the process over the last year of writing another book for the ABA. And one of the things that has astounded me is the number of senior leaders who have gone to ombuds. And I think that comes from credibility, and it comes from access to see how they work and what they do.
Thank you, Chuck. Angela, do you have anything you want to add on that? Oh, you're on mute.
No, Chuck answered it. Thank you.
Okay, Arthur? Good.
Good.
Thank you. We have a comment in the chat, and I apologize because I'm just having a problem scrolling. So give me 1 second. We have a comment in the chat that has to do with how ombuds brief governance bodies, which is just in part what you were talking about, and the use of annual reports. And so I'm just wondering if, Angela, you can tell us in your experience as an ombuds, how you used or didn't use annual reports in your practice, and how they were, and how you interacted with those senior leaders.
Sure. So I brief leaders along the way about different trends that I was noticing, whether it was the president or whether it was, various departmental chairs or deans regarding things specific to their areas. And of course, we have to do that in a way where it doesn't jeopardize anyone's anonymity, but also also do annual reports. And annual reports that, reflect the trends, and also just reflect the different outreach that was done, and how people engaged with the ombuds services, and how the ombuds engage with the community, the organization. those reports were for the first few years put on the website. On the website, it doesn't go into different examples or scenarios just because it's a small organization that I served. And so larger organizations sometimes give different examples of situations. I didn't do that because it was just too small of an organization. It would jeopardize it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Arthur, we have a question about some of your comments, and an audience member is asking, what can we do in support of research that is needed?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that it would be best if the research could come from outside the Ombuds community, because people are going to see that as sort of promotion. And research that I have seen tends to be a lot, and I'm already convinced. And I don't think you always need research, but there's so many who insist on it. I think if you could get some, MBA types interested in this, or people doing organizational development kinds of research that really could develop some systematic studies with some real heft to them, to design the surveys and gather data about sort of, particularly if they could do before and after with the creation of ombuds offices, and or looking at some of the areas that I mentioned that are selling points, sort of looking at least some of those and seeing, okay, let's focus in on this one, for example, like productivity. Can we measure some kind of increase in productivity or decrease for that matter? But it's probably something that would need to take place in academia. I don't know if IOA has the budget to maybe fund some independent research on that, but I just think there are a lot of folks who just want to see numbers when it comes to making budget justifications, and I'm not necessarily one of those folks, but it's a very common phenomenon, I think.
Thank you. And I'm just going to add, there was a note in the chat from Dick Fincher to say that let conflict resolvers know that there is funding available for workplace research from the National Academy of Arbitrators Research Foundation. So I'll make that as our public service announcement. Right now, we are at 3:29. So what I'd like to do is thank Chuck and Angela and Arthur for their very insightful comments today. And thank you for having this discussion. Also, because this is the last session of 9 sessions in the Future of Workplace ADR, have some other thank yous to make as well. And so I want to thank all of the panelists and moderators who brought us those 9 sessions on the Future of Workplace Dispute Resolution. Of course, we want to thank the LIRA Executive Director, Emily Smith, and the Membership and Marketing Coordinator, Bernadette Timon. Thank you for hosting and organizing us. We want to thank the LIRA Dispute Resolution Section leadership, and particularly Dick Fincher for his vision and work in actualizing this series. So I'm sure that I've missed some people, and I apologize for that. But thank you very much. And thank you again, Chuck, Angela, and Arthur.
And thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
I mean, you've had a tremendous role not only in putting this together, but other parts of it. So that's
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Yes.